Previously on Fisher's Shop, I started to remodel my laundry room. I stuck some wood on the wall and added some pipes. And then my wife added some flowery things on a shelf, and once she did that, ta-da, done. Well, not yet. I need to add a drying rack. But since this room is so small, I wanted to design an adjustable one so that we could still move around in there while it's in use. And this is what I came up with. It's basically just a frame with some dowels mounted inside to make the rack. And it would be on a hinge so that it could be lowered down when we need to use it. And this whole piece is supported by some brackets that wrap around a set of vertical rails. There's a tiny tooth at the bottom of each bracket that clips into some notches that are on the rails. This makes it so I can grab the whole thing and slide it right on up the rails and adjust it to any height needed. This will let me use the drying rack and still be able to move around in this tiny room. Well, at least that's the plan. Let's see if I can make this thing. Fortunately, it looks like this project won't take much lumber to build. I head back to my lumber storage area, climb up on my stool, and pick through some of the boards that I've been able to liberate from my neighbor's garage over the years. And since this build is primarily shorter and narrower pieces, I can use up some of the particularly gnarly boards that I've had sitting around. The first step is to get everything planed down to exactly 3/4 of an inch. I wheel out my planer, and then I start jamming boards through. And when I had them all pretty close, I could put them all through in sequence until I had them all down to their final thickness. Then at the joiner, I could put one clean and square edge on each of the boards. And then referencing that edge, I could take each one over to the table saw and rip out a bunch of strips for each of the pieces that I'll need. And I even rip some really skinny pieces down to square stock that I'll end up using to make dowels. Everything got sorted and labeled, and then I was ready to start building. The first thing I needed to do was to make the dowels. I began by using a technique that I've used many times before, but I just had awful luck with the stock breaking every time I did it this time. So instead, I chose to use the router. I put in a roundover bit, and I adjusted my fence so that it was in perfect alignment with the bearing of the bit. And once I had it all set up properly, I could simply run each piece of stock through, one pass for each edge, and then I had some rough dowels made. Lastly, to smooth them out even more, I just chucked them up into my drill and gave each of them a good sanding. Next up, I could cut the pieces for the drying rack frame. Now this frame will be assembled using half laps, so I need to mark where the exact center is and then set my table saw blade at this height. I just made a mark on the edge of one of the pieces and then used real small adjustments and test cuts until I could sneak up on the perfect blade setting. Once I thought I had it, I did a few cuts and then I test fit some pieces together to make sure. Now with the blade set perfectly, I could go ahead and cut all the half laps for the frame. And once that was done, the next step is to drill the holes for all the dowels. I drew a center line down each of the sides and then marked where each one should be. I punch a starter hole at each spot, and then take it over to the drill press to make some holes. The dowels get trimmed down to their final length at the miter saw, and then I can sand the very ends until they fit into the holes on the side of the frame. Next, I gave all the pieces a really good sanding. And it was at this point that I discovered if you sand like a maniac while wearing a Fitbit, it thinks you're running a marathon. So I felt it was only prudent to take a break and give my feet a rest after this workout. Alright, now we can put this thing together. I twist each one of the dowels into the holes on one side, and then give them a few taparoos to make sure they're seated all the way down. Then I fit the other ends of the dowels into the other side and hammer that one home as well. I set the front and back pieces in place and make sure everything looks good. And it does. So let's glue it up. I squirt on some glue and then I set the pieces in place. I don't bother gluing in the dowels because I don't think it's necessary. Then I throw on some clamps and I leave it to dry overnight. The next day I can pop off those clamps and place the piano hinge on the back of the frame. Now to give it a nice clean look, I wanted to inlay the hinge flush with the frame. So to mark its position, I held it in place and then I traced it with a utility knife. Then, using a router set to the same depth as the thickness of the hinge, I could remove most of the material. Afterwards, I used a chisel to remove the rest. I started by first accentuating the knife line and to make it a deeper cut. Then I just kept the chisel flat against the frame and I pared away the remaining material. It almost looks like I know what I'm doing, but you know better than that. After working at this for a bit though, I had the hinge fitting perfectly. And with that in place, I could use a self-centering drill bit to poke some mounting holes, and then the only thing it needed was a subtle roundover and some sanding, and the frame was done. Next, I could make the brackets. Now, these things are weird. I start by setting my table saw miter gauge to 45 degrees and cutting in some half laps for the main body of each bracket. With all of those cut, I could smear some glue on and stick them together, and then clamp them up to dry. Now you might be saying, that's not weird looking. Well, we're just getting started. Next, I shave off a couple small triangles that will act as teeth which will hold the brackets in the notches of the rails. I spread some glue on each of them, and sprinkle a little table salt on them to keep them from sliding around, and then I weight it down so that it can dry. Now for the teeth to work, there has to be a piece of the bracket that wraps around behind each of the vertical rails. This way, the weight of the rack will pull this piece against the back of the rails and force the teeth at the bottom of the brackets into the notches. This will all make sense for you in a bit, but here I am gluing on that piece. Now once it's dry, it kind of looks like a hodgepodge of randomly glued nonsense, but the bracket is in there, I just gotta cut it out. At the bandsaw, I nip off as many of the pieces that stick out that I can. I just trim them as close as I can without cutting into the main body of the piece. And once I have it looking pretty good off the bandsaw, I can flush up some of the edges using my crosscut sled on the table saw. Okay, now as if things aren't weird enough already by themselves, I'm gonna temporarily glue them together to create an even bigger, weirder thing. See, with them together like this, it'll help me make them identical. First, I flush up the ends on the miter saw, and then I can use the belt sander to flush up the outer edges. And when those are looking good, I can flip my cart and then use the disc sander to take off the sharp corners. Alright, now I can pop them apart, hold each one in my hands, and then realize that I should not have popped them apart yet. And here I am putting them back together because I'm an idiot. I still needed to cut the notch in them where they'll be mounted onto the piece with the hinge. Doing a test fit. And that looks good. Last step for the brackets is to add a roundover and to give them a good sanding. And then they were done. And just like me in high school, they look kind of weird, but they should do the trick. You can see how they'll work though. They'll slide up and down the rails like this, and the teeth will fit into notches that are cut into those rails. Okay, let's fasten them on. I spread some glue and I fit each of the brackets onto the ends of a piece that the drying rack will later mount onto as well. And with that dry, I can go ahead and fasten both pieces together by screwing on the hinge. And to avoid splitting the wood or stripping out a screw, I just did this all by hand. And yes, I had to find a way to get one of Grandpa's old flathead screws in there. Next, I could screw the rack itself onto the bracket mount to complete that piece. And I just did this the same way, playing it safe and doing it all by hand. Now I can make the rails. I taped them together when cutting out the notches so that they both be perfectly identical. And I made 5 cuts, which in the end will give us 5 different adjustable heights for the rack. I wanted to take off the sharp corners in the front, so I used my compass to round off the corner, and then the disc sander hogged all of that material off in just one pass. And I softened the rest of the edges at the router table, and then the rails were done. Next up, I needed to make several offsets that would hold the rails away from the wall. I used my 3-2-1 block to set up my stop block on my crosscut sled, and then I could quickly cut out 4 pieces. I gave each one a round over on one of their edges, and then glued them down onto the rails. Now to connect the rails together, I need to make the main mounting boards. Once I had them cut down to size, I carefully laid everything out and I used painter's tape to trace the mounting locations for the offsets. And once I have those spots marked, I can poke a hole through the board at the drill press and then countersink the backside. Now I can glue the rails on. But this was a real weird glue up. I didn't anticipate this being as hard as it actually was. See, the offsets hold the rail off to one side. Plus, the front stands proud of the offset, so it's very difficult to get straight down clamping force. I ended up just clamping on some blocks to act as braces and simply weighted down the rail instead of using clamps. Later, once the glue had dried, I checked on it and, thankfully, it seemed to have worked just fine. At this point, I could flip the piece over, drill out the hole into the offset, and add a screw for reinforcement. Then I repeated the same steps to fasten on the second rail. Once it was all together, I gave it a good sanding, but I was really eager to test it out. So I clamped the rails onto the shop door, and then I got to test out my design for the first time. Yup, that dorky grin is genuine. I was pretty excited to see that my design actually worked. Alright, we're in the home stretch. Let's get some finish on this thing. And for that, I'm using Odie's oil, just like I used on the previous pieces that have gone into the laundry room remodel. It's a super easy finish to use. You literally just buff it on, and I'm using a Scotch-Brite pad for that, wait a bit, and then buff it off. It's just nice not having to worry about getting a spray finish down into all the hard-to-reach areas and drip marks and dry time, etc. You just smear it on and wipe it off. Done. Now, since my house was built by Martians, my studs are 18 inches on center instead of the rest of Earth, which has them spaced at 16 inches apart. So I mark my mounting locations and counterbore a couple holes for some screws, and then I bring the whole thing upstairs with me. Once there, I mark where all my studs are, get it all lined up just right, and drive in my first screw. Then I just make sure it's level, and I drive in all the rest. And to cover those ugly screws, I just use the leftover dowel cutoffs. I pound them in, then I flush trim them off. And I'm not using glue here, so that if I ever want to take this off the wall, I can just pop the plugs out and unscrew it. Adding the rack piece. And it works great. And when I push it up, it's clear over my head, and I'm 6 feet tall. This is perfect. This thing really did turn out great. I wanted to design a drying rack that would be out of the way when not in use, and out of the way when it is being used, and I think I did just that. Not to mention, it's pretty sweet looking too. The figure of the black walnut is just so pretty, and it adds a ton of character. The unique design of the brackets adds a bunch of interest, but also makes it simple to operate. I love it, and hopefully you do too. If you do, and you want to try making it yourself, I have detailed step-by-step plans available on my website over at fishersshoponline.com. Hey, if you liked the video, be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below. And if you're brand new to the channel and you feel I've earned it, consider subscribing. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Wow! Well, I made a dowel. It's only 2 inches long. Ooh, that sucker is hot. Bummer. Should be good, right? Should be good. I think we're good. I hope I'm good. Oh, the battery ran out. Oh, I need a different bit. Oh, bummer. Where's my hammer? I could have sworn I brought a hammer up.